Good morning and welcome to the Mitigation Planning Coffee Break Series and today's topic, Tribal Mitigation Planning. My name is Jonathan Johnson and I'm your host today. Your presenters today are Brett Holt, Aurora Lair, and Kathy Lynn. Brett, if you're all ready, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate it. We've got a really good group today here. I was just going down our attendance list. Ben Lovers, it's good to see you on here. Have not seen you in quite a while. We go back to University of Oregon, but I know you're at the Tulalip tribe right now. It's exciting to see you guys participating on this. And of course, going down, we've got some of our FEMA staff on here that I work with. Joe and Jay coming on here. Kelly Isham up in Alaska. These are all areas either you've been working with tribes a lot, we're just starting off there. Bev O'Day, done a lot of work here. I can see you signed in here doing a lot of work, of course, with tribes around, not just here, but, in the Region 10, but throughout the country. I think this is a great topic. Tribes, when I started with FEMA a little over 8 years ago, I didn't really have experience with tribes prior to that. I had experience working with other cultures, being a Peace Corps volunteer, going overseas. But as you come in and you're working within this environment of being with the federal government and you're doing this nation-to-nation contact, you're working with them in this realm of these regulations that we have under mitigation planning. It was a new world for me. And over this course of 8 years, it's been exciting. There's a lot to learn. And I think those that are outside of a tribe and you're working with them on these plans, just come in with that open mind, recognizing each one's unique in how we approach it. They've got, the history of the tribe. Each one is unique there. For us in Region 10, doing work in Alaska, versus if you're working with a tribe in Oregon, it's just different on that. But it's exciting, and I'm always learning something with tribes as I'm developing the plan. We're helping them in terms of just tribal sovereignty and them just trying to take care of their tribal members and their people. And so it's really exciting to have this topic today. I call it establishing the tribal mitigation planning framework, but for a couple of reasons. One is it's not just about the requirements. I'm going to hit on some of the tribal planning requirements, but if you've been following us this year on this coffee break series, you've noticed we've been going over that. And so there's pieces when we started about building the planning team back in February, whether it was local, tribal, you're doing your county or city, it was the same thing. We did the risk assessment back in May. And, those requirements, some of that stuff we've kind of hit, but I wanted to focus today on a few things in regards to what are some of what might be unique to tribe, like a particular requirement that only tribes have to address, or it's perhaps just the approach. Maybe it's the same planning requirement, whether you're tribe or local, but I want to provide some examples of how a tribe might approach it. Also, I didn't want to just focus on planning. I think the plans are a gateway to just what are mitigation programs that are available out there. And so I'm going to hit on a couple other programs today. If you were here just for the planning requirements, I'm sorry, I'm going to let you guys down just a little bit here. But we do have trainings, not just the webinars, but we have a couple in-person trainings, not just in Region 10, but there's stuff throughout the country that we will provide resources for. Today we have Aurora Lair and Kathy Lynn helping us out. Aurora's been with us, and I'm going to get this wrong. You can help correct me when you get on Aurora. At least 2-3 years with FEMA. Doing a lot of great work in establishing and building that relationship between FEMA and the tribes. And she's going to give us this big picture of where are we with FEMA's relationship with the tribal nations, how are we helping support them. And then Kathy Lynn, she's a coordinator of the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project. She's out of University of Oregon. I first met Kathy Lynn back about 8-9 years ago when I was a grad student at the University of Oregon. Kathy does a lot of work, not just with tribes, but around mitigation, a lot of some groundbreaking work initially in Oregon around the community wildfire protection plans. So wealth of experience with Aurora and Kathy, and I'm excited to have them on here. Of course, Amanda Syak, you're on here today. You're helping to support us with the Q&A. Amanda and I are the mitigation planning team here for FEMA Region 10. So as I've mentioned, what are we going to learn today? How FEMA supports the tribal nations, select tribal mitigation planning requirements I'm going to go through. What are some FEMA programs supporting tribal mitigation? Well, how tribes are developing their respective mitigation planning frameworks. So what are some examples out there? And of course, looking at the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project. And a great build-off from last month when we had Michael Cardwell from the Quinault Indian Nation talking about the work they do out here on the Washington coast. So I like to start this off, of course, all of our coffee break. What are we talking about with mitigation? What is this in terms of emergency management? Mitigation is the reduction or elimination of long-term risk to human life and property from hazards. We're looking at property, we're looking at human, we're looking at the natural environment, and those impacts and where we have this overlay where people live, we're trying to reduce that, or the hazards and the people where you have this overlay. We're trying to reduce those impacts when we do have a wildfire. Recognizing that we can't hit it all through mitigation. Of course, we have our preparedness activities. We are going to have to do response. It's just going to happen here. But we're trying to minimize response and minimize recovery through our mitigation actions. We want to get people out of the flood zone. We would like to move them up away from where tsunami inundation zones are at. We want to protect them where the wildfire-urban interface lies. And it's challenging work, no doubt. And a lot of time when we're successful at it, nobody knows because nothing happened. But we know it because we are there doing the good work. And so mitigation, it's exciting for those who hopefully been in it for a long time. Only one on here I can see, and Bev, I'm not sure how long you've been doing it. Joe, you've been doing this thing a long time on here. And so, you know, a few of us have just been, been doing this for well over a decade, 2 decades, maybe more. It's exciting work, though. But you can see we're doing it before the disaster, so once we have it, maybe we have less response. Few people are putting themselves in harm's way. And then recovery, of course, we want to mitigate. Mitigation increases resiliency through a variety of activities. And we've been touching on a lot of these through this coffee break series this year. But ultimately, it's about resiliency. In this case, of course, it's also about tribal sovereignty and how the tribes taking care of themselves, and native villages to, take care of their members. So I got a poll I'm going to throw up here real quick. Just want to get an idea of how you guys have been involved with the development update of tribal mitigation plans. Here in Region 10, we have 37 tribal mitigation plans that are approved. That's with our Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. We have 271 tribes, of course. And so we still have a lot of work to do. Now, overall, statistically, we've had up to 57 with approved plans, but some have expired, some are in development. We have some ones that are being updated. We have a lot of new ones, especially out of our Alaska native villages. So we have a lot more opportunity to increase those numbers. But it's just not about increasing numbers, and it's not just about being eligible for a FEMA grant and whatnot. It really is just a how do we help our people? How do we help reduce that risk? So with that, my little cursor wasn't working here. Where'd it go? There we are. I'm going to turn it over to Aurora. And just quickly, hold on before Aurora starts. Looks like a lot of folks we have more, about almost half of you that are on this webinar have not been involved with the development or update of a tribal mitigation plan. So we have a lot of new folks just learning about this, and that's great to see. Of course, we have just about half of you that have been, a good almost 50-50 split about your involvement with these mitigation plans. So glad to see everyone on here, and I'm going to go ahead and just close this poll up, and I'm going to turn it over to Aurora. Aurora, you have to unmute, I think.
Okay, how's that?
Thank you.
Can you hear me all right?
That's perfect.
Okay.
You bet.
I'm always very cautious when it comes to any sort of presentation. I don't want to be caught off mute. Anyways, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. My name is Aurora Lair, and my Tlingit name is Kalanya, my Hawaiian name Hokuokalani, and I am one of the 4 tribal affairs staff at FEMA Region 10. I just wanted to give you, kind of like Brett said, a little overview of where FEMA and tribes, kind of where the FEMA tribal relationship is. I'm going to go to the next one. So those of you who already are with tribes know this information anyways, but just for those of you who might not be as familiar, there are 567 federally recognized tribes. There are, of course, throughout the country, there are others that are state recognized, but there is a special, legal, political relationship between the federal government and tribes, and that is that nation-to-nation relationship. And that's something that I would say, going based off of my past experience in the private sector and in the nonprofits, FEMA really is at the forefront of positive, making sure and to prioritize positive relationships on that government-to-government level with tribal nations. I'd say there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to working with tribes. We understand that, and that's, I think, one of the things that does make working with tribal nations so exciting, and also, especially when you get into projects like mitigation planning, there are nuances and there are specifics that come into play with each and every one. Not all tribes are land-based. We're talking about everything from a tribe who's, right near an urban center versus an Alaska Native village that's, not connected to any road systems and, can only be reached by air, essentially. And again, so there's a wide spectrum, there's a huge variety, and that, those variations also, of course, move into emergency management capabilities. The chart on the right-hand side kind of gives you a breakdown of where the, where the concentration of tribes are within the FEMA regions. So here in Region 10, we do serve 271 federally recognized tribes, so just under half of all of the tribes in the country. That isn't necessarily correlated to the population. So again, just to kind of give you an overview of what it is that, how it looks from the FEMA side. And moving on to the next one. So FEMA does have a tribal vision. FEMA has a tribal policy and also a consultation policy. When it comes to any sort of federal action that will have, lasting impacts for one or more tribes, then, there is a requirement that we consult with tribes, and that's something that, again, FEMA has prioritized. And so the tribal vision is really, it's placing FEMA in the support role, right? Like, we want to make sure that we're doing everything to support the efforts that communities, including tribes, have already begun. And so we want to and we understand that, not just with tribes, but with, especially when it comes to mitigation practices, planning, and, activities, relationships really are key, because it's not about a single person or a single entity. It really is about that connection and those relationships. But, making sure that when we do establish those relationships, we are respectful of and supportive of tribal sovereignty. Okay, go ahead to the next one. So there's a lot of text on this slide, and I do apologize for that. But just since Brett said you have a few slides and see what you can do. So this is, wanted to make sure to get just kind of, again, that overview. Because we are within Region 10 and there's such a high concentration of tribes here, our region has put tribal affairs at the top, and so everybody within FEMA Region 10, or within FEMA generally, is responsible for making sure that we have a positive working relationship with tribes and that we're supporting their efforts. But we also have 4 dedicated tribal affairs staff. So you see on the right-hand side there, our lead is Aaron Ward, and then up in our Alaska area office, we have Ramona Van Cleve, and then myself and Jay LaPlante are just over 2 years. And we are in positions called Tribal Relations Specialists, and they are positions that were created specifically, I think we're the only ones in the country who are named as tribal affairs. And, for those of you who are not in Region 10, I'm sure you're jealous, because Region 10 is the best. The great state of Washington and Alaska, especially, my hometowns. But outside of Region 10, there is a tribal liaison within every single FEMA region, and we do, check in monthly amongst ourselves, amongst the regional tribal liaisons, just to see what the different issues are going on around the country, and see how we can help support one another. So you can see on here, we have kind of a dual set of our missions, and that is, kind of a steady state where we are most of the time, and then of course post-incident during a disaster, there's a different level of support that is offered at that point. So the next slide, we start to talk a little bit about, I really like this timeline because it shows, one, just how new, especially relative to other federal entities, shows how new FEMA is, right? FEMA was only officially created in 1978, and at that time, states began to receive emergency management funding. That's EM. Again, pardon the acronyms. We love our acronyms in FEMA and in the federal government. And so states have been building up emergency management capabilities, since the late 70s, at least. I would say most likely it was already happening, but by a different name. And so through this entire time, up until 2013, tribes were supported as part of the community, but anytime any sort of federal assistance, post-disaster assistance was required, they would have to work through the states. And acknowledging tribal sovereignty, there was a law change saying that tribes, as sovereign nations, have the option to seek that federal assistance directly from the federal government, rather than only having the option to go through the state. So now that options are out there, there's been new guidance issued, again, considering those different, damage levels and kind of the unique circumstances that tribes face, or tribes have in serving their people, or our people, I guess. But you'll notice that, the emergency management funding has not quite caught up. And so there's a definite gap, I would say, in many emergency management programs. And, when you have this robust program that has been continually funded by states versus, the programs within tribes are often on an as-funded basis. And so just some of the differences that we work with there. When it comes to mitigation planning and mitigation activities, on the next slide here, we're starting to look a little bit into, emergency management, which of course includes mitigation. Right now we're in the open period for the pre-disaster mitigation grant program and had a whole series of webinars on that. So it's kind of entrenched deep in my brain right now, but that's kind of one of my main topics that we've been talking about, and really appreciate the fact that there's so much interest from Brett and the entire team here in supporting tribal mitigation planning, because we know that mitigation planning, it really does open up the door to so many other programs, and then it really just gets folks thinking, what is it that we can do, and being proactive about taking steps to increase their, not only resilience, but it really does bring people together. So I think that's pretty much everything I had to cover.
Well, that's all I'm limiting you to, so you have a lot more you can do, Aurora. We know that, but thank you, Aurora. Appreciate this. I'm glad you're not biased against Region 10, but I think you're right. This is a really great region to work in. As everywhere, though. I mean, there's a lot of great regions out there. We are fortunate to have both Aurora and Jay, of course, Ramona and Aaron, this tribal team here. So really appreciate that. I'm going to move on here, and just want to say thank you, Aurora. Everyone will get slides after this, of course. We'll send those out. You can see Aurora's contact information if you want to reach out to her or anyone else with our Region 10 staff. And, of course, if you're outside of Region 10, there was a link to go to where the other contacts are for tribal liaisons in other regions. So mitigation planning, you know, throughout this series, we've had other tribes already speak about their experience with developing and implementing plans. We've had the Lummi Nation. Stacy Falwell was able to join us back in January. We were fortunate last month to have Mike Caldwell from the Quinault Indian Nation talk about their experience there on the coast. And of course, in July, we had Patty Perry speak to us from the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla Reservation. So if you guys are just looking for more, you know, what's the experience with tribes and how they're implementing and developing those plans, please take a look back at some of our previous coffee breaks. But I want to go into some of what's this planning process. And I just want to say from the overall high level, this process that you go through to develop a tribal mitigation plan or the local mitigation plan, it does have similarities here, from maybe approval of tribal leadership to developing the planning team or getting the planning teams back together, setting up goals, stakeholder engagement, the public engagement. Now, how we define public, and I'll talk about that, might look a little different. Risk assessments, capability assessments, developing your strategies of how then you're going to reduce risk to where your problem areas are at. Of course, continue to engage your public, plan adoption and implementation. So this process here does have a lot of similarity. Interesting thing with tribal requirements, it is a kind of a morph of both local planning requirements that FEMA has as well as the state. And that's because of both the tribes having that sovereign status, and they can be an applicant coming direct with FEMA. We have certain requirements that they would have to do where the state does. But then also recognizing that they're tribal members and that engagement, and they're at that local level and they own their land. That's where some of these local requirements come from. So benefits, you know, there's a variety of benefits that, you know, to doing mitigation planning, and, you know, increasing awareness of the risk, aligning your risk reduction activities with tribal priorities, especially getting tribal leadership to buy in on this. And we know that's very important. Sometimes work doesn't start, and even sometimes FEMA doesn't get to come in and talk and initiate projects on tribal until the tribal council has approved this, and that's very important with our tribes as you're working with them. But it's important, a community-driven living document, you know, this is something that doesn't just sit on the shelf. It helps identify financial and culturally feasible actions, and that's that prioritization process that you're going through. That's why you have your stakeholders and your tribal members come and contribute to this process, understand what are the, where should we be putting our resources. But over on the right, you know, I think it is funding eligibility. I'm going to talk to the second one here. It is important, of course. It's not the only reason, but it is important in terms of not just pre-disaster, but when there is a declaration. And we'll talk about that a little bit here, about what does this bring to provide. And self-determination. Tribes, we don't take care of themselves and the people and governing. And I think putting the grant side aside, I think just going through this process, say, what should we be doing? Where are those risks and how do we reduce them? And even if we know where those risks are at and we think we know how to reduce them, do we have the buy-in? And that's what this process is going through. And that's why you don't do it, you know, in small groups. You bring in an inclusive process here. So we have requirements. You know, we do have what's called in the Title 40 or 44 CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, 201.7. So for those who are familiar with our requirements, 0.6 is the local requirements, 0.7 are our tribal planning requirements. And we have a planning guidance that's out, and we're updating. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the requirements of what the tribe needs to do, the Alaska Native Village needs to do, we released those back in 2010. It's in this blue book. I think we have a few blue books over the years here, but that's our cover, and it is in the FEMA library, and you can always contact myself to get a copy if you're not sure where it's at. But it requires that these plans are updated every 5 years. Prior to this, having 201.7, this is back in 2009, I believe we did an update to the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. Tribes either got to choose a local or state at that time, but that no longer is acceptable. You are now adhering to what those requirements are for 201.7. So what does it make it eligible for? I won't go through all of these, but you can see that where there's a yes, that means a plan must be in place. And if a tribe wants to be a direct applicant, that means they need to, that's when they work direct with FEMA, versus if they're a sub-applicant, that's when they go through the state and then up through FEMA. And it will kind of says, especially public assistance, when that becomes available in a post-disaster environment, that's pretty important to know if the funding's there or not. And then, of course, down to our HMG program or pre-disaster mitigation grants, quite a bit. So let's see what else we have here. Updated tribal mitigation planning guidance. So you can see here that we are working on this. Final review will be this fall, and it was probably delayed a little bit. FEMA's been now a little busy with our hurricanes in the southeast. But we have some high-level changes going on that. And we're going to have webinar, high-level changes being, just clarifying the probability of future hazard events. We have some enhanced planning requirements and clarifying those for tribes. We have a new review tool. But we're going to do webinars later specific to this new guidance and the updates. So we'll keep you guys posted. And so we will let you know when this comes out. So let me focus in on some, I say select planning requirements because I think it would be multiple hours, of course, to go through all of them. But I wanted to kind of just show some examples of what we've seen. I want to go and just highlight what are some of the thought process, whether from what we've seen with reviewing plans here at FEMA to what we've even heard and feedback that we've received from the tribes or the contractors that help supported the tribes. So, goals. The tribes are, all the tribal mitigation plans have a set of goals, and you can see throughout this I put a requirement. I've underlined for emphasis, that's not actually underlined in the CFR, but it says the strategy is going to include a description of mitigation goals. And I think it's important to look at in tribal plans, and as you're working with tribes, or if you're a tribe yourself, why are we doing this? And we recognize that it is for eligibility for funding, but what else is going on here? And I like where the Cow Creek tribe out in Oregon said, upholding its sovereignty, identity, and self-governance. It's to help mitigate the vulnerability of the tribe's people, property, natural resources. And it's just something that helps to kind of set the stage of what this plan's about here. I like to guide future economic planning and development to include natural hazard risk assessments. So as you're working with tribes and you yourself are a tribe, you're updating and developing your first-time plan. I think it's important to think beyond just that grant eligibility, and I think that helps set the stage that even if the disaster declaration doesn't come through or a particular grant doesn't come through, it's like what are these other reasons that we're working towards and what else are we trying to do? The planning area is different with the tribal plans. We have, because what it might say is, as Aurora mentioned earlier, some tribes have land, some do not. And so there's a couple ways that when we think about the planning area, that the reservation, trust land, non-Indian fee lands, and the tribes will describe this in of what this looks like in their plans. And I think it's important to establish it now because it's something also when you're going for a FEMA declaration of what that area looks like when you are trying to look at what the impacts are and what areas are included. I'm not saying there's a direct correlation versus what you put in the plan to what the declaration is, but I think, start having that discussion now. What are we thinking about? And who else do we have to have if there's other partners involved with the lands that the tribes are identifying in the planning area? And then what jurisdictions will participate? There are some options here where the tribe can have their own plan, a single tribal mitigation plan, the standalone plan. It could be a standard plan or enhanced plan. Standard means you're just hitting basically we only have standard plans so far. No tribe has been enhanced. There are requirements if they want to go above and beyond of what needs to be enhanced, and that makes them eligible for even additional mitigation dollars when there's a declared disaster. So there's an option here, but then there's also could be multi-jurisdictional where the tribe will be with a local city or county. The village also can work with the local city and they do a plan together, and that is an option. they still have to meet their requirements. So the tribe would still meet the 201.7 requirements, and the local communities would still meet their 201.6 requirements. So the Makah, when they said, here's establishing the planning area, the Makah tribe's up there in the northwest part of Washington. They said this plan is a single jurisdiction plan covering the entire reservation and areas defined as having cultural and historic significance to the tribe. Includes the people, property, infrastructure, natural environment within the boundaries of the Makah Reservation as established by the Treaty of Niabe, and so on and so forth. But you can see how they've kind of spelled out, this is what we're looking at for our plan. The other way of then, I just want to show examples then on how the way that the plans might start to look is on the left is when the city of Eagle and the native village of Eagle, they did a multi-jurisdictional plan. And this is actually fairly common with Alaska native villages. There are some instances where the native village has a single jurisdiction plan, but it's fairly common in Alaska to get these multi-jurisdictional plans. Here with Skagit County, there's the county, the multiple cities, and there's 3 tribes that were part of this particular plan. The Samish, Swinomish, and the Upper Skagit Indian tribe were part of the Skagit County plan. And then over in Idaho, the Shoshone-Bannock tribes developed their own standalone plan. And these are just different options of when they're establishing the planning area, what this might look like for a tribe. So I'm going to go, I have another poll coming up because we're going to start talking about planning teams. I need to open up this poll here. So I'm just asking, for those who have worked with this, I know half of you have not. But if you have, or maybe you have some ideas, what stakeholders do you involve in the tribal mitigation planning process? And, some of this might look the same with our local plans, and some of it might have some differences in what that discussion starts to look like. But I'm going to give you just a minute here. I'm going to get a drink of water, and we'll move on. Yeah, one moment. As you guys are answering that, let me just see if we can go back. We had some questions here. Have any tribes been declared emergencies? The Seminole tribe in Florida is operating under a federal emergency declaration currently. We had a question about where I can view previous presentations. We have the link, and so there's a link that, obviously I'm not going to read off that URL, but we do have this, of course, when we send off the presentations, this presentation, the link is in the PowerPoint. You can go there. And apparently, Michael Cardwell, I was pronouncing your name wrong. I apologize, but yes, you are with the Quinault, but I'm sorry about that. But of course, Michael Cardwell, who was with us last month there. So also this question about public outreach after being adopted. Well, public outreach is just saying that public outreach is during the plan update, but you also continue to engage your tribal members after adoption, which of course is one of our requirements, is saying how do you continue that public engagement after adoption during the life of the plan there. So that's definitely one we like to see, and we highly encourage tribes, villages, counties, cities to continue that discussion there. So it looks like as I look through, it's pretty. I never did quite figure out how to share the poll. But, of course, tribal members is a high one, the tribal leaders, community planners, emergency managers. It's pretty good. Most of them, everyone's kind of saying was a little bit of everything. If you have other tribes that are nearby, it might be good to involve them. Now, how we engage these tribes might be a little bit different in terms of, or any of our stakeholders, in terms of do they actually sit on the planning team, or are they a stakeholder we engage at certain points throughout the process here. So I'll go ahead and just close that poll. Thank you very much. So planning committees, we have a requirement about who is involved in the process here. And you can see, council, tribal elders, those are really two important ones with tribes that we've seen on these committees here. Natural resource specialists. Another big one because of that connection with the land, and I'm always excited to see sometimes the lead for the tribal plans is not always emergency management. A lot of times you might see the natural resource department or the community development, the community planning department that are the lead. But there's a variety, of course, of members that might be included in this. And we always encourage, if if you can involve or have a touch point with the local, with other tribes or the counties that are in the area, that's always a good, may always be a good idea. Of course, we always look back on what that relationship, of course, looks like. So here's some examples. The Ho Indian Nation on the left, they had the housing manager, tribal councilwoman, public works, some council members, natural resources director, fisheries and wildlife, so on and so forth that were on this. And then up in Alaska with the Loudoun Tribal Council, they had the administrator, the first chief, the second chief, council members, and then of course the state was there to help support them with their mitigation planners, state hazard mitigation officer. So different makeups, perhaps depending on the locality of where people are at. Quickly, there's a question about where our resources help tribes develop plans. We'll get to that at the end of this webinar so that we make sure you guys got that, of course. So defining the public, the tribe is asked how do they define the public, whether that just means their tribal membership or are they looking elsewhere beyond just tribal membership. And sometimes that's just based on their land base. So on the Jamestown Solemn tribe, it was they solicited input from tribal citizens and non-tribal citizens alike. Although the emphasis and outreach was naturally on the tribe, the public is considering the plan to be all interested parties and not only the tribal citizens. But we've seen it where it was just tribal membership also, and that is what we ask in the plans is just to identify what does this look like for you guys. And so with public engagement, Michael, you might be able to recognize, of course, there on the left when we had, you guys did a series of workshops for your tribal members, and they also were hosting some food that evening to come in and listen throughout. This is through their public engagement process, through the update of the plan. Then on the right, just messaging. When you're engaging the public, it might look different depending on who you're engaging. Tribal leaders, and maybe everybody wants all the same thing on the right, but it is something to consider if you're talking to the tribal leaders or the business enterprises, the tribal departments. What is that messaging? Protecting culture, history, and resources. Who's interested in that? Is it everybody? Who do we have to emphasize? How about the appropriate stewardship of the land? Benefits and goals for the government and protection of investments. Capability assessment, that's one that it's a requirement. And for those who have worked with the tribal plans, you've developed yours, it says pre and post disaster. Usually it's where it says pre and post disaster mitigation, hazard management policies, programs, and capabilities. This is a piece where this is your capability assessment. It's looking at your planning and regulatory, your administrative and technical, financial resources, education, and outreach. And I think it's important here to take some time of not just what you have. Yes, we have this. Okay, but what do they do? How do they contribute to mitigation planning, or mitigation, I should say, overall? But also recognizing, like, I look at this grants manager, such a big one. If you don't have the capabilities here, let's say you don't have someone who doesn't do grants management, recognize that that be something you're trying to pursue, hopefully, in the future. It's not just important pre-disaster, but especially post-disaster, if you ever do try to go for a declaration. But then also maybe an engineer, and if you don't have it in-house, is it something you contract with, which could be important, especially if you're trying to implement a project. Do you have someone that you come in a contract? Do you work with the counties? Is it done in-house? The financial resources, understanding that is it reliant on other grants from federal government? Do you have local business revenues such as gaming revenue, enterprise revenues? Do you have fees from festivals or campsites, recreation fees? And that's just again looking at, if you have to do a match perhaps for a grant that does come through, where some of those resources help do that match, whether it was a planning grant or you're doing one for a project grant. So here's an example. This was from the Shoalwater Bay. This is on their administrative technical capability. You can see where they are listing some of the staff or personnel resources. And then, do they have it? And then it just talks about the department agency position. and what that starts to look like. It's real simple, but I think even just fleshing out, not just yes or no, do you have it, but where is it at and maybe how they contribute. So thinking about this when you're doing your capability assessment, not just for administrative technical capability, but all your capabilities. The risk assessments for the plans, you know, we're defining the planning area of where does this assessment occur. But then within that, where some of our plans might focus on population-built environment, you know, we might see in our tribal mitigation plans much more focus on the natural environment and the interaction of the people with that place, that land. And so that description becomes pretty prevalent, but then also the cultural and the historical resources. Now, from a, and these are some of the, you know, the different community assets that you might think about: people, historical, cultural, sacred sites, economy, structures, critical facilities, the natural environment. In terms of the historical cultural sites, I want to say that this is not a requirement, of course, to list this, and this is an example of how that was addressed at the Cow Creek tribe. You know, it says here it was not identified or analyzed. In some cases that we might find in a plan, it was looked at, but it's not included for us to look at in FEMA, and that's perfectly fine. But I think it's important through the process, and even if, of course, it stays within the tribal, within the tribe, of just saying, okay, where are those? We know, I would say, you know where the sites are at, but then what do those impacts look like? Because when it does come with some of our declarations and getting the getting a declared disaster, that could help contribute in terms of there was impacts to these areas. It was such the case with the Upper Skagit when they were able to get qualify for a hazard mitigation grant program a couple of years ago, and some of their cultural sites up on National Park Service land. So just thinking about this a little bit. We're not asking for specific, like, show us a map where locations are at. You could even just say generally, we're not including this. But when you're doing and working with the tribe, I think it's important at least to have that in consideration, even though it doesn't have to be in the plan. And the last one I just want to touch on is project monitoring. And this isn't, you know, we have a requirement here about the plan maintenance include a system for monitoring implementation of mitigation measures and project closeout. So this isn't just about looking at the plan itself, and we're going to meet and just look at the plan, but it does come to specific projects. You know, what does this look like, your schedule, who's responsible for doing that, managing the grant, doing the financial reports. It seems a little bit out of the realm of just mitigation because that's just basic project management, but it is important to consider this through the development of the plan, especially if this is your first interaction with FEMA and you're thinking about getting ready to manage some FEMA grants, or if you're thinking that in the future, it might be, if we get a declaration, who's going to be responsible for helping? There's a lot of funding that will come through. Who manages this? And so thinking about what that system looks like, whether you have it in place or not. I have an example from the Lummi where they said the Water Resources Division served as the team coordinator and was the lead for applying for mitigation project grants, managing these grants, and providing information. I believe that's to the mitigation team and the general counsel on project progress. And they say how for the PDM grants, the Water Resources Division submitted their quarterly financial reports and through the e-grant system. So there's not a lot of detail, but there's already some thought about who takes care of this. And this is something I don't always see this much, you know, even to this detail, you won't see that in the plan, but I really encourage for the tribal mitigation plan, start taking that, because that's a little, because this is about the tribe being an applicant and working directly, in this case with FEMA, with the grants. A little bit different than if these are counties or cities who are always the sub-applicant through the state. So take some time on that. So with that, that's all I really have for touching the planning requirements, but I want to switch it over to Kathy Lynn with the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project, who again has done a lot of work. And I'm just going to have her touch on what they're doing here in the Northwest. So, Kathy?
Thank you so much, Brett. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Great. Well, thank you for the invitation to join you all today. Brett asked me if I would just spend about 5 minutes talking about the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project and some of the resources that may be relevant to tribes that are working on mitigation planning and climate change adaptation. So you can go to the next slide. The Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project was founded in 2009 with a goal of really connecting tribes to the federal agencies and programs and around climate change, and to really ensure that tribes have a voice in how climate programs and policies are developed. We work really closely with tribes all over the Northwest and public agencies, including state and federal agencies, intertribal groups, and non-governmental organizations. We facilitate a network, the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Network, and we meet by phone on the third Wednesday of every month at 10 a.m. And I send out probably 3 to 4 email bulletins a month that have information on grants and climate trainings specifically focused on tribal issues. And we also try to work a lot on the policy issues. The affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission are some of the intertribal partners that we work really closely with in identifying what those policy priorities are, many of which kind of center on understanding what that federal trust responsibility is to the tribes in a climate change context. And so it may be anything from advocating for funds to be continued in the federal budget for the Tribal Climate Resilience Program that has enabled the Bureau of Indian Affairs to allocate funds for tribal climate adaptation to a wide range of issues. So I guess the first thing I'll do is just invite anyone who would like to know more about the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Network to email me or call me after this if you're not already a part of it. It's an open list that I manage to just really try to get more information out about opportunities to engage in climate change. Next slide. One of the things that we have created over the past few years is an online searchable database to help ensure that information about grants and programs and other resources are available to tribes. And so this is a screenshot to the Tribal Climate Change Guide, but if you type the web address into your URL after this webinar, you'll see that it is updated with grants that are due at the end of September. You can search by keyword, you can search by geography if you're looking for grants specifically in the Northwest. But this does have information nationally. There's also, when you go to the guide, you'll see there's a new search bar at the top in the green, the dark green area, that allows you to search the whole guide. So if you're interested in Federal Emergency Management Agency programs and type that in FEMA into the search bar, it'll give you a list of FEMA grants and FEMA programs that may be relevant. You'll see other tabs here. We have an tribal adaptation plan list. That tab is specifically listing all the publicly available tribal climate change adaptation plans that we are aware of. We update this. I have students who work with me, and we update this guide every week. And so if you're ever on the guide and you think there should be more information added, if there's something missing or you'd like to see different kinds of resources, you can email me directly and we'll get that updated. One of the things Brett asked me to talk about, I don't think we have too much time today, is looking at the nexus between climate adaptation and disaster mitigation. And I think that the main thing I'll say right now is I think there is a huge opportunity to leverage really limited tribal resources for planning when thinking about climate adaptation and the disaster mitigation planning process. Both involve climate vulnerability and risk assessments to identify priorities. Both tribal outreach and engagement is a direct need for climate adaptation planning. And so I guess at this point, I would just kind of float out there this idea that looking for those opportunities to bridge climate adaptation within disaster mitigation planning, to leverage those resources and look at the climate-related hazards and what the potential impacts or things that tribes are already experiencing because of climate change and how that relates to disaster mitigation. I just think there's a huge opportunity to explore that. And maybe we can do that in another coffee break someday in the future. But I know that we're close to the out of time. So Brett, you can go to the last slide, which just has my links directly to the examples of tribal climate change adaptation efforts, whether they're plans or implementation. They're available on the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, and they're available through profiles that we've developed here in the Northwest, and also that the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, which is based at Northern Arizona University, have developed. And then the last slide includes my contact information as well as links to the overall Tribal Climate Change Project. You can see minutes from our monthly conference calls, and then a link to that searchable database, the online Tribal Climate Change Guide. So I will leave it at that and invite you all to contact me if you're interested in learning more. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kathy. Appreciate you taking the time to be with us, and I recognize everything here is always probably too short. And but please join Kathy. You know, she's got the monthly calls. She's got a series of emails that goes out. And I think important is just recognizing, as we're thinking about this mitigation planning framework, where are those resources that we can help use to support the tribes. So thank you very much. So I just want to end off. I know we're looking here about 3 minutes to 10. I'm probably going to go about 5 minutes over, as I think we do each month. But I want to look at a few other FEMA programs that help support mitigation. And as we're thinking about that framework and what are some other programs out there, you know, the planning process can help think about what other things are out there. You know, having that discussion as you're updating your mitigation plan or developing it for the first time, where else should we be looking besides just grants? So we have a risk map program in FEMA. It's a mapping, assessment, and planning program. This is FEMA. We could go direct with tribes. A lot of times it's the state risk map coordinator that we've gone through, and then we have tribes that are participating where these watersheds are at. We've got a number of tribes in the Pacific Northwest that do participate with these projects. But if you have an opportunity to participate in this, it's a multi-year process. It could ultimately, you know, be updating a flood insurance rate map, but I recognize that there's many tribes. Actually, just let me flip it the other way. There's very few tribes that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. Even though that's a component of this, there's a lot of other products and technical assistance that comes through this program that would benefit the tribes: outreach products, training, mitigation planning, technical support, so on and so forth. So if you have an opportunity to participate, you hear about it, please participate. You're more than welcome to contact. You can contact myself, and I can get you in touch with the appropriate person in each region who leads these efforts. I do put the National Flood Insurance Program. I believe, and I was talking to our floodplain management staff this morning, how many tribes in the Northwest do participate? Right off the bat, there wasn't one quick number there, but we think it's probably about 12 or so, which is few. And I know there's challenges to implementing that. But I put that out there just as an opportunity where it might make sense in terms of just getting, you know, yes, it is requiring ordinance, but it's helping to move people out of the floodplains by having that perhaps an availability of insurance that might be there in case of a disaster, and that less reliance on governments and support and rebuilding faster. This could be an option, but I think during your mitigation planning development update, looking at this and talking about this, does this make sense for us? Should we be participating? What are the challenges and what are the benefits for us in a pre and a post-disaster environment? We also have an earthquake and tsunami program assistance. We have a number of programs here that are available for our tribes. They help, you know, whether it's some documentation or training. But if you're interested in more, we have a link to some documents. You can reach out to us. Well, currently vacant is our earthquake program manager, but you can still reach to me, and we do have contacts for this. We also have states that have a earthquake program manager that you're more than welcome to reach to, and we can get you in touch with those appropriate people. But there's some great assistance that you might be able to find through this, especially if you live in a seismic area, tsunami area. And of course, the hazard mitigation assistance. We talk about that eligibility. You don't qualify for these programs unless you have a plan in place. Now, you can use these programs to develop your plan and then be eligible for the projects, but our pre-disaster mitigation grants, our flood mitigation assistance grants, and the hazard mitigation grant program, which is post-disaster. The PDM and the FMA are pre-disaster. PDM's open right now, and we had some webinars going on. We've had them since August, so we've only got a couple more left for topics. You can see we have one on developing planning grants, October 5th, 10 a.m. We have a couple on getting into e-grants, October 12th and 17th. You know, Aurora, I have Jay's number still on here, and I know Jay's deployed down in Florida. Would it be more appropriate to contact you on these webinars? Aurora, I'm sorry.
Yep. Oh, yeah, that's
okay.
fine.
Okay.
So it's just 4917 instead of 4540 is my direct line.
Okay, so that's 425-487-4917. And she can get you the information for the, and these are specific for tribes in the developing the tribal mitigation planning grants and the e-grants. So please join us for that especially if it's your first time. Someone was asking plan development resources. We've got a series of them right here that will help get you going. Of course, some are online. You can always go to EMI. We have a variety of tribal curriculum that you can go seek and you know, go back east to Emmitsburg, Maryland for the classes. We also offer classes out here that you can participate in, learning more about tribal mitigation planning and just mitigation overall. So I hope overall, you know, we've been able to hit some of these I hope we've hit all these objectives. Again, I'll apologize if you wanted to go through every planning requirement, but I thought it was more important to kind of, as I said, framework. What is this world of mitigation, planning? How does planning help inform some of these other mitigation programs? We were just talking about how FEMA supports the tribes. What are some of the select mitigation planning requirements? What are some examples of how tribes are establishing their planning framework? And of course, able to talk about the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project. In-person trainings, 2 more coming up. Anchorage, Alaska, next week. Amanda and I will be up there, 27th and 28th. If you're interested, contact me. We'll get you information. It's also on the Coffee Break website. That class is just about full. We got a full house there right now. And then Camp Murray, we're going to be down just north of Olympia, November 1st and 2nd here in Washington. And, you know, this year we've hit all states. So we've had a really full year. I don't have a schedule for next year yet, but this is where we're at if you're interested. Next month, join us. We're addressing social equity through natural hazard mitigation planning. We've got City of Portland talking. We have University of Washington talking about social equity. I'm really excited about this. I have a lot to learn, I admit that. But please join us. We have registration that's already open on the Coffee Break website. And we'll obviously have that link in the email that we send out later today or next week. But please join us. We've just a few more months of this left. And then that'll be a wrap for us here. But November, integrating natural hazard mitigation plans and a comp plan. And of course, December, mitigation and recovery planning. And with that, I'm going to open our last poll up. Let us know how we did. What are some changes? We've heard from you. We've made some tweaks over the months. I can't say I listen to every piece of advice, but we do our best that we can to make it work here. You know, it's always always try a Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific. It just works best for our schedules and it's consistent. But we always record these. Reach out to your mitigation planning contacts. You know, Alaska, I should have put Rick on there. He's in the interim. We have that current vacant position, but if you're interested in any of these states, that's who you can reach out to. That's who Amanda and I reach out to at the state level. But let us know how we've done. And with that, Jonathan, I'm going to turn it to you to close this.